Hey guys, tonight we're about to step back into a world where midnight was not just a deadline for finishing that last scroll or quill stroke, but a fundamental part of everyday life. Medieval Europe, a place where sleep habits are as mysterious and tangled as the thorny hedges surrounding a monk's monastery. Imagine settling yourself into a straw-filled bed, a thin, rough wool blanket pulled up to your chin, and yet, instead of drifting into one long night's sleep like we do today, your slumber is divided, interrupted, and sometimes haunted by ideas and fears that seem downright bizarre through modern eyes. It's a time when the very concept of sleep was less about a solid 8 hours of restful oblivion, and more like a series of short, wandering dozes with strange rituals and superstitions woven around the whole process. And you probably won't survive this. Nope, not without some serious medieval resilience, or at least a good cup of mead to soften the memories. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world, because we're about to get sleepy, no matter where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself in a medieval town or countryside. The sky darkens into a deep, inky black, with only the flickering candles and torchlight casting dancing shadows on stone walls. You might think that people were just curling up in their cozy beds, but the truth is, sleep was a far more complex affair. Their nightly routines and sleep patterns were shaped by a jumble of practicalities, superstitions, and the simple fact that artificial lighting was scarce. Fireplaces, candles, lanterns. No neon lights or Wi-Fi to keep them up all night. Instead, folks relied heavily on the rhythms of the natural world, and that meant their sleep was often segmented. Historians still argue whether this divided sleep pattern was a natural rhythm, or merely a necessity born from the limitations of medieval life. Some scholars believe that these two sleep periods, with a wakeful interval in the middle of the night, were a reflection of the body's natural ebb and flow, what some now call biphasic sleep. Others argue it came mainly from societal needs, people rising for prayer, tending to fires, or just listening to the eerie silence filled with the distant hoot of an owl or the howl of a wolf. Still, it's fascinating that this pattern isn't entirely unique to medieval times. Studies of pre-industrial societies suggest many humans have always had some kind of segmented sleep. Though it's often glossed over in modern sleep research, one of the quirkiest tidbits in this sleep puzzle is the idea that during these night wakings, people might have used that time for reflection, prayer, or even a bit of light reading by candle, if they were lucky enough to have one, before drifting back into a second sleep. But of course, it wasn't all laziness or peaceful awakenings. These night interruptions could also be the result of discomfort, illness, or the need to relieve oneself. Medieval sanitation was, let's say, not quite up to modern standards, so finding a suitable chamber pot at 2 a.m. was an adventure in itself. An early form of what you might call nocturnal agility night watchmen, or watchmen as they were often called, played a huge role in shaping medieval sleep habits. These brave souls were the medieval night shift workers, tasked with guarding cities, castles, and monasteries from fire, thieves, and monsters, or at least mythical ones. Their patrols, loud bells, and shrill horns didn't just keep the town safe, but also set a rhythm for the community. Everyone knew that around midnight, the watchman's call signaled a kind of collective pause in the night silence. This also meant that many folk might have stayed awake or awakened at around that time, either to listen for the watchman's cry, or because the whole town was waking up for a brief period. Imagine a village clock tower tolling midnight, the crisp air thick with a mixture of anticipation and fatigue. No wonder sleep was often fragmented. And what about the environment? Well, medieval rooms and beds were a far cry from our modern plush mattresses and soundproof chambers. Most beds were essentially wooden frames with straw, feathers, or wool piled on top, sometimes a combination of all three. These were communal affairs, with entire families often sharing a single sleeping space, especially in colder months. Privacy was a luxury, and the idea of individual rooms was usually reserved for the wealthy or the clergy. The room itself was a smoky, warm shelter from the cold outside, lit by the flickering flames from hearths or candles, so much so that eyes had to adjust to the flickering shadows and smoky haze. Sleep confided with the nocturnal setting. The scent of burning wood, the flickering of candle flames, and the gentle creak of the wooden beams overhead created a natural ambience, but one that could also be unsettling. Noisy nights would sometimes bring the sounds of my scuttling or the distant howl of wolves, making sleep a somewhat elusive pursuit for many. The environment played a crucial role, less a sanctuary of deep rest, more of a shared, slightly chaotic realm where comfort and insecurity danced together. Medieval folks had rituals to try and secure that precious, restful sleep, many rooted in superstition and faith. They would hang charms, often made of herbs like lavender or chamomile, over beds to ward off evil spirits or bad dreams. Charms inscribed with prayers or saints' names might be pinned beneath mattresses, while lucky symbols, like certain knots, crosses, or even tiny relics, were tucked into pillowcases. Sleep was considered a vulnerable time, and so they sought divine protection against nightmares, demons, or restless spirits that might slip into their dreams. Some believed that a haunted sleep could rot the soul or invite misfortune, so rituals and charms weren't just comforting. They were essential diet, and drink also wielded their influence. It's amusing to think that medieval banquets of roast meats, spicy sauces, and wine could keep you awake, while a simple glass of ale or herbal tea might ease you into slumber. Certain foods, especially those rich in alkaloids or herbal infusions, were favored for their soporific effects, even if the science behind it is a little more modern and less magical than they believed. Historians still debate whether they truly understood how digestion or alcohol affected sleep, but they certainly had firm beliefs about what could hamper rest, such as too much spicy food, which was thought to cause nightmares, or overeating, which might lead to a restless night filled with indigestion. There were also remedies like mugwort or poppy resin, used in small doses to coax insomniacs into slumber. Or, at least, that's what the old texts suggest. Midnight awakenings weren't just accidental. They were often woven into the moral and spiritual fabric of the medieval mind. The watchman's cry, the late-night prayers, or even the stirring of evil spirits were all part of a shared nocturnal landscape. Many believed that these awakenings were opportunities for divine guidance, as if God or the saints kept watch over the sleeping human soul, ready to reveal divine dreams or messages if one was alert enough. They believed dreams could be divine communications, offering warnings or prophecies. Others thought that waking in the middle of the night might be a sign of the devil trying to tempt or torment the sleeper. So they'd recite prayers, hold crosses, or repeat psalms during these incidents, hoping to keep the night's shadows at bay. Somnambulism, or sleepwalking, also had its place in medieval stories. People told tales of restless spirits or cursed souls wandering aimlessly in their sleep, sometimes spilling secrets or causing accidents. Some doctors of the time thought these episodes were caused by demons or even divine punishment. Other scholars argued they had a more natural basis, possibly a form of hysteria or a psychosomatic response to fever or stress. Whatever the explanation, these sleep disturbances added to the sense that sleep was not a simple, peaceful state, but a liminal experience caught between the physical and spiritual worlds. Ripe with danger and intrigue, religious influences pervaded nearly every aspect of sleep. Prayer was central. Many monks and nuns would kneel in their cells, reciting psalms or hymns before bed, believing that divine blessings could ensure peaceful dreams and divine protection during the night. Dreaming itself was often seen as prophetic. Saints appeared in dreams to give warnings or guidance. Some even believed that divine dreams could foretell future events, and importantly, that a good sleep was a gift from heaven. Saints' relics or holy water might be placed under pillows or on bedside tables to ward off evil or invite divine visions. The nocturnal realm was considered a liminal space where heaven and earth touched, and where divine intervention could occur if one was humble and faithful enough. Regarding sleeping arrangements, the medieval world was a patchwork of communal beds and individual sanctuaries. Though, again, the wealthy could afford separate private chambers. Peasants often slept crowded in one large room or shared beds, pressed close for warmth, comfort, and security. Shared beds helped prevent cold, but it also meant that sleep could be disturbed by the slightest movement, someone snoring, a restless child, or the twitch of a limb. Nobles, on the other hand, boasted separate chambers with feather beds, luxurious hangings, and goblets of wine to lull them into sleep. Still, these beds weren't the soft, mattress-filled thrones of our modern dreams. They were rough, sometimes lumpy, and shared with insects or vermin. Reminders that comfort was a layered story of survival and status. Medieval sleep medicine was a mixture of herbal remedies, charms, and folk wisdom. If someone couldn't sleep, they might try a handful of dried herbs, like valerian root or lavender, or get a dose of a concoction made from honey, herbs, and sometimes even animal parts. The idea was to balance humors or spirits responsible for sleep, according to their prevailing medical theories. In more desperate cases, the healer might prescribe a potion infused with poppy or mandrake, plants known for their sedative properties, though dangerous if misused. These remedies weren't just about health. They were part of a larger spiritual and magical worldview, with healers acting like mediators between worlds of natural and supernatural. Nighttime fears cast long shadows, literally. Folk tales of monsters, spirits, and witches lurking in the dark filled the medieval imagination. They believed that evil creatures could slip through cracks in the walls or hide behind shadows, ready to snatch away the unwary sleeper. Protective rituals, charms, and prayers were meant to keep these terrors at bay. Think of iron-tipped charms, sacred herbs, or the waving of holy banners to keep the spirits outside. Some communities believed that ghosts or malevolent spirits could cause nightmares, illnesses, or even death if they weren't appeased properly. And so, you had your ghost stories and folklore to explain the unexplainable, like a haunted night or a mysterious, waking scream. All these practices, fears, and customs fed into a vast fabric of sleep-related folklore. Tales of dreaming saints, cursed bedrooms, and enchanted beds were passed down through generations, warning children to sleep quietly or suffer the consequences, usually in the form of a bad dream or a visit from a mischievous spirit. Certain days or festivals might have special rituals to ensure good sleep, and stories of witches crafting spells to steal sleep or cast nightmares persisted in village tales. These stories weren't just bedtime tales. They were woven with morals, supernatural warnings, and cultural values that reinforced what was right and wrong about sleep, and waking social status built its own layer of sleeping practices. Nobility slept in plush chambers, few shared their beds, and they had servants to attend to their comfort and privacy. In contrast, peasants often snoozed in crowded, noisy rooms, where the cold and dirt were constant companions. Wealth could buy better bedding, private chambers, and even separate sleeping hours, but it didn't guarantee uninterrupted sleep. After all, comfort was relative, and their worries ranged from invasions to the day's harvest. Social rank also influenced the kinds of charms and rituals they used, loved or feared superstitions that reflected their place in society. And whatever the practice, the goal remained the same: to secure enough rest to survive another day in a world full of threats, spiritual and terrestrial. As we reflect on these customs and ideas, it's clear that medieval sleep was a complex dance of physical needs, spiritual beliefs, social customs, and environmental factors. It was a life where sleep wasn't just about health, but an act woven into the very fabric of existence, filled with magic, mystery, and a touch of chaos. These practices and beliefs have left a lasting impression, some echoes faint, some surprisingly modern, showing how deeply human the need for rest and reassurance truly is. The medieval approach to sleep reminds us that, despite our many technological advances, we're all still trying to find a sense of peace during the night, something that, by their standards, was wonderfully, hilariously, kaleidoscopically complicated. And while we've come a long way in understanding sleep scientifically, perhaps there's comfort in knowing that our ancestors also faced their midnight monsters, charms, and divine dreams. Though, thankfully, they didn't have social media to keep them awake. Imagine settling in for the night in medieval Europe. Your bed a simple wooden frame, perhaps draped with rough linen sheets, and your sleep broken into oddly timed segments. Now, before you dismiss this as just a quaint peculiarity, let's step back and explore a fascinating pattern of sleep history that's as curious as finding a mouse in your cheese. You see, the way medieval people slept wasn't a straight shot from bedtime to dawn like we often imagine. Instead, their sleep was divided, broken into two distinct periods, and the roots of this oddity stretch way back into ancient times, long before your medieval neighbors dozed off under their thatched roofs back in the days of the Roman Empire. A similar sleep pattern existed. Historians still argue whether this divided sleep was a cultural norm or just a matter of chance, but the evidence suggests it was quite common. Ancient texts, from Roman physicians to Christian monks, mention a first sleep and a second sleep, as if sleep had a built-in pause button. The Earl of the Middle Ages, you might say, was pressed into a two-part night, rather than the seamless 8-hour snooze we idealize. Picture this. You drift into your first sleep around sunset, sink into a restful nap, and then wake with the stars still flickering outside your window. During this waking period, you might recite prayers, meditate, or, here's the fun part, perhaps get up and have a little midnight snack, disturbingly similar to some sleep routines we're seeing now with late-night binge-watching and snack fests. This segmented sleep wasn't just a quirk of medieval folk. It had quite firm roots in the scholarly debates of the past. While some modern sleep scientists have examined the phenomenon through a biological lens, pointing to our circadian rhythms and melatonin fluctuations, historians endlessly argue whether division in sleep was simply practical or deeply woven into cultural and religious routines. Some suggest that it was more convenient in a time when artificial lighting was scarce, and people lived in harmony with the natural cycle of daylight and darkness. Others argue that it's a myth that all people slept that way, emphasizing that records are patchy and oral traditions often romanticize the past. Still, the historic consensus seems to lean toward the idea that, in a world untouched by electricity, humans naturally fell into two smaller sleep periods instead of one long sleep. During your first sleep, you might groggily find yourself awake, lying amidst the moaning wind or crackling fire. Some scholars think this waking period lasted about an hour or two, during which people might reflect, pray, or ponder their dreams. And here's a quirky tidbit. You could argue that medieval folks had a built-in early morning alarm with real spiritual overtones, because they believed their dreams during this awakening could reveal divine messages or secret warnings from saints. Think about that when you wake up in the middle of the night, wondering if it's just indigestion or a heavenly sign. This whole divided sleep pattern was just part of their daily rhythm, a feature, not a bug, in the fabric of medieval life. And because energy and wakefulness are tied to light, the night's natural darkness played its part in shaping these hours of wakefulness. Historians still debate whether this waking time was just a natural consequence of the human body trying to adapt to night, or if it was actively cultivated through social routines. Many ancient texts mention the watching hour, a period of quiet contemplation or prayer, reinforcing the idea that this was not just a biological response, but also a cultural ritual. You could think of it as the medieval equivalent of your late-night social media scroll. Except instead of memes, you'd be praying, meditating, or maybe chatting with your spouse if you shared your bed. And speaking of social routines, this divided sleep likely served multiple purposes beyond spiritual reflection. For one, it was safer. Imagine old towns with narrow, lit streets and watchmen patrols. People needed to be alert during the hours when their village or town was most vulnerable to threats, be it bandits, wild animals, or rival factions. Staying awake for a period allowed watchmen to do their rounds, increasing personal and communal safety. For some, the waking hours might have been used for work, mending tools or tending to livestock, activities that wouldn't wait until dawn because, remember, no modern alarm clocks or coffee to jump. Start the day back then. In fact, that's part of what makes this split sleep pattern so interesting. It wasn't just a biological feature, but also a practical response to medieval life's demands. If you had to be prepared for nocturnal threats or care for animals, sleeping in two chunks made sense. Plus, this pattern meant that people could go to bed with the setting sun, wake up in the middle of the night, do some tasks or reflect, then drift back into sleep until dawn. This wasn't laziness or confusion about natural rhythms. It might have been the most effective way to marry work, safety, and rest in an era devoid of electric lighting. Any modern attempt to replicate this awakening phase, perhaps during a meditation or quietly journaling, is, in fact, echoing a long-held ancient human trait. The notion of broken sleep has been rediscovered lately. People experimenting with biphasic and polyphasic sleep schedules, trying to meld the old with the new. And the funny thing is, some early pioneers of sleep hygiene couldn't help but notice that their ancestors' pattern might not be so dysfunctional after all. So, the next time you find yourself waking up in the dead of night, grumbling about insomnia, consider this. Perhaps you're just tapping into a primal rhythm that's been part of human history for centuries. Your medieval ancestors wouldn't have viewed your middle-of-the-night wakefulness as a problem, but as a natural, even essential, part of their nightly routine. It was a time for reflection, for divine connection, or, even in more practical terms, a chance to get ahead on work or hush a restless child in the next room. In the end, this concept of divided sleep is a reminder that sleep patterns are not just about biology, but deeply intertwined with cultural, practical, and spiritual factors. It's a swirling dance of human needs and natural cycles, echoing through time, from the flickering candles of medieval chambers to your own late-night thoughts. And perhaps the most comforting idea of all is that sleep, much like history itself, is a layered, complex story, sometimes interrupted, sometimes divided, but always a vital part of being human. Even if you're only dreaming about it, you're still part of this ancient, ongoing rhythm. In the dim glow of the candlelit evening, as the shadows stretch long across stone walls and flickering hearths cast dancing patterns, medieval folk would settle into their nightly routines, sometimes divided, sometimes not, but always influenced by a curious mix of practicality and superstition. But amidst all these rituals and routines, one of the most unusual features of their sleep pattern involves those itty-bitty figures they depended on to keep watch through the dead, silent black hours. The night watchmen. Yes, medieval towns and castles had their own designated guardians of the night, people whose job was to stand guard, keep lookout, and alert everyone if trouble was brewing. And surprisingly, these watchmen weren't just about warding off bandits or invading armies. They also shaped how the average person experienced sleep now. Picture the scene. There you are, slumbering peacefully, or at least attempting to, when suddenly the clang of a bell or the cry of a watchman echoes through the stillness. Their shouts might be loud, commanding, or even a little theatrical. These figures weren't always highly trained soldiers. Sometimes they were conscripted villagers or even children, chosen for their reliability or to keep costs down. Their duties included patrolling the perimeter, listening for sounds of trouble, and ensuring the safety of the community during the long, dark hours. Their presence, or sometimes absence, directly influenced how, and when people slept. Historians still argue whether medieval communities truly slept in the divided style we associate with later centuries, or whether the watchmen's patrols imposed a kind of fragmented pattern. Some scholars suggest that the regular, audible presence of a watchman actually reinforced an interrupted sleep pattern, making people more accustomed to waking during the night. Others propose that the whole idea of one centralized watchman was more about symbolic authority and social control, rather than a straightforward safety measure. Still, in many cases, these figures became woven into the fabric of nocturnal life, creating an environment where sleep wasn't a continuous, uninterrupted stretch, but punctuated by the routines and sounds of the watchmen. Imagine the mental landscape they had to navigate. The watchman's call ringing out suddenly, startling you from your dreams. The sound traveled through the cool air, bouncing off walls and corridors, a sonic cue that all was still quiet, or perhaps not so quiet after all. Some communities even had a tradition where the watchman would whistle a specific tune, kind of like a medieval ringtone, to signal that all was well or to warn of danger. It's almost charming, or downright quaint, how these simple melodies could become part of the nightly soundscape, like a lullaby for a community on high alert. And that's not even mentioning the stories and superstitions woven around these figures, like the idea that watchmen could see things beyond the natural, ghosts, spirits, or even visions of the future. Depending on how superstitious your village was now, consider the size and design of medieval watchtowers. These weren't just high points to shout from. They were often the tallest structures in the area, designed as outposts where a single individual, armed with little more than a spear, a lantern, and a sharp pair of observational eyes, could keep an eye on the horizon and spot trouble from miles away. Think of it as a nightly game of Where's Waldo, but with more danger and less coloring books. Sometimes these watchmen would switch shifts, perhaps every couple of hours, which meant that the households below didn't always get to enjoy a full, restful sleep, uninterrupted by the buzzing of their heads wandering into dreams, only to be jolted awake by the latest patrol call or a distant shout. But their influence extended beyond noise. The very presence of a watchman or their absence affected the social rhythm. In some cases, if a town was particularly vulnerable, the watchman might be stationed at key points within the community, the gates, the main roads, or the castle perimeter. Their watches became part of the schedule that governed nightly life, dictating when people could relax and when they needed to be alert. This sense of constant observation, combined with the community's awareness that trouble could arrive at any moment, fostered a certain vigilance among the townsfolk, which might have made peaceful sleep feel like a fragile luxury. Some cultures even employed bloodhounds or dogs to serve as live alarms, barking at the slightest hint of threat, further complicating sleep patterns. But the watchman's role was mostly human, and humans, well, they aren't exactly known for being silent or subtle. Their calls, footsteps, and occasional lantern flickers created a soundtrack that people had to accept as part of entering or leaving their nightly rest. This relentless nocturnal activity could lead to certain subconscious patterns. For example, some scholars believe that the presence of a nightly patrol might have contributed to the idea that waking during the night, or at least being alert during the late hours, was an inherent part of medieval life, a stark contrast to the ideal of continuous sleep many later cultures strive for. In fact, there are hints that people's sleep might have naturally been split, or biphasic, partly because of the social and physical cues embedded within the landscape and routines. Think of it as a sleepy echo of our own modern napping habits, but in medieval form, just with more bells and less modern comfort. In certain cases, the Watchmen's presence became even more superstitiously charged. They sometimes wore amulets or symbols to ward off spirits or the evil eye, which reflects the deep-rooted need to protect oneself from unseen dangers lurking after dark. And in some regions, these watchmen were believed to have supernatural powers, like the ability to see into the future or interpret omens, further linking their nightly duties with the world of dreams, divination, and divine messages. It's as if their service not only kept the physical community safe, but also tethered them to the spiritual realm in a complicated dance between the natural and the supernatural. And let's not forget the day after, when people would discuss their encounters. Strange sounds, mysterious lights, or even encounters with ghostly figures supposedly spotted by the vigilant watchmen. Sometimes, these stories grew into local legends, reinforcing the belief that the night was inhabited by a realm hidden from the day's view. Interestingly, some scholars suggest that the stories told around the communal fireplace about watchmen sightings could serve as moral lessons or cautionary tales, illustrating dangers that lurked in the dark, danger that was both real and imagined, a tapestry of fears woven into the night's fabric. So, next time you think about night shift workers or late-night security personnel, remember that medieval watchmen had a far more symbolic, spiritual, and communal role. Their presence was a constant reminder that night was not simply a time of peaceful rest, but a shared, active space filled with expectations, dangers, and mysteries. Their calls, their lanterns, and perhaps even their superstitions shaped how communities darkened their eyes and braced themselves to face sleep, or the interruption of it, each night. They were, after all, the early guardians, half official, half mystical, and their influence seeped into the very fabric of medieval sleep, turning it into a complex pattern of vigilance, superstition, and shared stories. And if you ever wake up suddenly at midnight, listen closely. You might just hear the echo of their calls in the quiet dark, a whisper from history reminding you that the night has always been a community affair. Imagine slipping into a medieval chamber, where the air is thick with the faint scent of herbs, wax, and something quite peculiar, possibly a hint of damp stone and the faintest hint of burnt pine. The room itself isn't quite what you'd expect if you're used to modern bedrooms. There are no plush mattresses or memory foam pillows lurking here. Instead, medieval sleeping environments are simple, often Spartan, and deeply functional, reflecting a world where comfort wasn't always the priority but survival was. The walls are made from rough-hewn timber, or in wealthier homes, perhaps dressed in plaster or woven tapestries, though even those are more for decoration than comfort. These walls serve as a barrier, not just against drafts, but also unknown nocturnal visitors, spirits, or perhaps the beast that might lurk outside. You might find that the floors are simply dirt, stone, or packed earth, so stark that some might wonder how anyone managed to catch enough sleep on such a surface without waking up with a crick in their neck or a stone in their back. It's common in many medieval homes for the only bed to be a raised wooden platform, often just a simple frame with a layer of straw or rushes strewn across for padding. Straw, of course, was the medieval equivalent of memory foam, peaceful, soft, and natural, until you rolled onto a hidden pebble or accidentally disturbed a nest of bugs. Now, the idea of an intricate plush bed is almost a fairy tale. Wealthier households might have had proper beds, carved from sturdy wood, equipped with curtains or drapes to shield against drafts or wandering eyes of visitors. These curtains weren't just for privacy. They often served as a kind of acoustic filter, muffling the sounds of the outside world, and the beds themselves. Think more about a giant wooden box filled with straw, covered with thick, coarse linen sheets that serve as a barrier between you and the roughness of the universe. Sometimes the linen was scented with herbs, lavender, rosemary, or thyme, meant to keep away pests and perhaps lend a faint aroma of freshness amid the dampness of the stone walls. Still, the overall feeling was closer to camping out in a rustic shelter than snuggling into a modern mattress oasis. The notion of a dedicated, cozy bedroom was far from universal. For many, the bed was part of a multi-purpose space, sharing the same room with a communal hearth, which supplied both heat and light. These rooms weren't separate sanctuaries but bustling hubs where daily life, sleep, and socializing all blended into one now. Picture yourself lying there, the flickering glow of a humble candle casting shadows on the walls. Or perhaps you're in a chamber where the only light comes from torches or the moon through a small window, if you're lucky enough to have one. Windows, if they existed, were tiny, thick with wavy glass or simply covered with oiled leather or cloth stencils to shield against drafts. All of these elements, crude beds, scant lighting, drafty rooms, created an environment that was more about making do than about pampering oneself. Yet somehow it worked. People managed to sleep in these conditions for centuries, resilient as ever nocturnal settings weren't restricted to the inside of the home either. Many medieval people slept in shared spaces, sometimes on communal beds, especially in winter or during times of hardship. Imagine a large hall filled with multiple beds or even just straw mats laid out on the floor, each space a small island of slumber amidst the chaos. On these shared beds, stories have been told of the older, more seasoned folks, how entire families or even groups traveling together would huddle under the same blanket, sharing body heat in a cozy, if not exactly private, arrangement. Privacy, after all, wasn't a priority then. Community and survival took precedence. Not to mention, in some cases, it kept away unwelcome nocturnal visitors, be they spirits, animals, or the occasional burglar. Speaking of nocturnal visitors, the darkness of the medieval world was a place full of imagination and often fear. Homes didn't just keep the cold out. They also kept out the monsters, spirits, and ghosts that folklore insisted prowled at night. As a result, many kept small, practical objects nearby: a crucifix, a carved wooden talisman, or a small bowl of holy water, items believed to ward off evil spirits lurking in shadows. Tiny charms were often sewn into the seams of bedding or hung above the bed, warding off nightmares and malicious entities. These charms, quite quirky when you think about it, ranged from simple crosses to more elaborate symbols with mysterious origins. Some medieval folk believed that demons could slip through cracks or under doors, so they'd seal windows with wax, stuff straw in keyholes, or hang garlic and herbs over beds as protection. And then there were the materials used for bedding, less about luxury and more about practicality. Swathes of wool and linen were common, and in colder parts of Europe, layers of furs and pelts might be added for warmth, especially for the wealthier classes. These materials not only insulated but also helped regulate temperature, though if you've ever tried sleeping on a sheepskin in the summer, you might realize that medieval sleep environments had their own issues with overheating or sweating through multiple layers. Interestingly, some scholarly debates still swirl around whether ancient and medieval people truly experienced more fragmented sleep due to the environment, or whether it was a cultural norm that was simply accepted as part of life. In certain regions, especially in colder climates, multiple layers and thick blankets created a barrier against the biting cold, but with a trade-off: a potential for overheating or difficulty in waking if one needed to rise during the night. The beds themselves often lacked any form of mattress as we understand it today. Instead, the straw or rushes served as the primary padding, refreshed periodically when it became soiled or dusty. This frequent change was considered a hygiene practice, though it probably didn't do much to prevent the bugs. The nocturnal setting also involved a careful balancing act, balancing warmth and safety, privacy and community, comfort and survival. Medieval people likely didn't enjoy the plush luxury of modern sleep environments, but their simple, functional beds, combined with the cozy, if often drafty, rooms, formed a surprisingly resilient environment that let them drift off into the night, safe enough in their ways. Sometimes, it's amusing to think that their idea of a bedtime routine might have been just as simple as tucking themselves in, whispering a prayer or whispering a charm, and then drifting into whatever sleep they could get, probably interrupted by the occasional creak of the wooden house, the distant howl of wolves, or the restless thoughts of the day. And so, as you settle into your modern mattress with its memory foam and climate control, remember that medieval sleep environments weren't just about function. They were part of a culture that embraced simplicity, community, and a deep connection with the natural world around them. All of these elements, rough beds, simple rooms, protective charms, and the sacred boundary of sleep, created an environment uniquely suited to their lives, proving that even in the harshest conditions, people find a way to rest and dream amidst the shadows of history. As you drift into the softly flickering world of medieval sleep rituals, you might imagine a nighttime scene filled with strange charms and whispered prayers, where every gesture was woven into the fabric of waking and dreaming life. In those days, sleep wasn't just a biological necessity, but a sacred act intertwined with superstition, magic, and a touch of the mystical. From the flickering light of a candle to the recitation of ancient charms, the medieval mind believed that sleep could be influenced, and often protected, by a mosaic of rituals designed to ward off evil spirits and invite divine blessing. You see, in medieval Europe, sleep was a fragile state often fraught with worries about demons sneaking into your dreams or restless spirits wandering through the night. To counteract these fears, people turned to charms, amulets, and specific rituals that were thought to secure peaceful slumber. It was common to hang charms over beds, such as small crosses or holy relics, believing these objects had protective powers, almost like spiritual bodyguards watching over you while you drifted into unconsciousness. Some even wore amulets around their necks or tucked them under their pillows, like the medieval version of a lucky charm, but with a divine twist. Imagine carefully tying a strip of cloth inscribed with sacred words around your bedpost, or positioning a tiny figurine of a saint nearby, each believed to ward off nightmares and evil influences. Tales tell of people placing blessed herbs, such as thyme and lavender, beneath their pillows, hoping the fragrant herbs would bring sweet dreams. Historically, the use of herbs in sleep rituals is well documented. Herbs weren't just for cooking. They were thought to have powerful properties, from calming nerves to dispelling restless spirits. You might find yourself surrounded by bundles of rosemary or sage, bundles that, according to superstitions, could chase away dark spirits and keep night terrors at bay. Bedtime prayers, too, played a critical role in preparing the soul for nighttime repose. You might have recited specific prayers or psalms, often the Psalm 91 for divine protection, or invoked saints believed to be guardians against evil. The idea was to close the door to anything sinister, not just with physical charms, but with spiritual defenses, like an invisible force field of faith. Some scholars suggest that these prayers and charms weren't just superstition. They responded to a complex worldview in which the boundary between the natural and supernatural was fluid, and divine intervention was as real as the bedsheets you tucked yourself into. But not all charms were religious. Some sprinkled a pinch of salt into the bed as a barrier against evil spirits, much like a medieval version of bad taste humor. Salt was believed to have purifying qualities, cleansing your sleeping space of negative influences. Others placed small bells on their beds or hung them nearby. The jingling sounds were thought to scare away malevolent spirits, much like a ghostly alarm system. Interestingly, medieval folks believed that certain sounds or signals could ward off spirits, which makes you wonder whether medieval house alarms sounded a tiny bell or a squeaky wheel to keep nightmares at bay now. Let's dive a little into the curious use of charms inscribed with magical symbols, especially those believed to trap or banish evil entities. Amulets etched with runes or symbols derived from biblical texts were often tucked under pillows or sewn into the seams of bedding. Some of these charms were said to contain spells that would trap demons or spirits who might try to haunt a restless sleeper. Historians still argue whether these charms had any real power. Some say they were mere placebo. Others believe they created a psychological barrier that helped lull anxieties to sleep. Either way, the idea that the right symbol could influence your dreams was ingrained very deeply. Much of medieval sleep protection involved a mixture of the old and the new, combining Christian faith with folk magic. For example, it was common to cross oneself before bed, and at the same time, hang a rabbit's foot or a piece of iron over the bedpost, as each was thought to ward off evil. The belief in iron's protective power isn't unique to medieval times. Even later, iron was associated with strength and immunity from evil, like an ancient medieval version of a security system, with a bit more symbolic pizzazz. Another fascinating aspect of medieval sleep rituals was the use of bedtime charms that involved singing or reciting certain verses. Children might be sung lullabies containing protective prayers, blending gentle melody with spiritual shield. Some families kept tradition by whispering gentle charms or wishing good dreams, like "Sweet dreams and angels keep," which might seem modern, but has its roots very firmly planted in the medieval desire for divine oversight. These nighttime invocations weren't just for children, but also for worried adults who believed that a whisper of enchantment could help a restless mind settle. And then there are the superstitions related to avoiding bad dreams altogether, be it a belief that sleeping with an object under your pillow could bring good luck, or that certain days were more auspicious for a peaceful sleep. These rituals served as psychological anchors. For instance, some believed that placing a mirror beneath your pillow could reflect away evil spirits trying to enter your dreams, though it might also have been a way to prevent restless spirits from entering during a midnight nightmare. Medieval healers and wise women also prescribed charms for sleep troubles, sometimes a simple prayer, sometimes an elaborate ritual involving silver needles to pin charms onto the bedding, or a small bag filled with herbs and ritual items sewn into the mattress. These remedies highlight the fascinating blend of medicine, magic, and religious faith that defined sleep rituals of the time. Sometimes, even the act of rubbing a greasy substance, like pig fat mixed with herbs, onto the forehead was believed to ward off spirits, a curious precursor to our today's idea that a good sleep starts with a little pre-bed skincare, perhaps. But not all charms were passive. Some were thought to have active properties, like a charm inscribed with the words of a saint or a prayer, a kind of spiritual talisman that could catch any lurking demon or restless spirit. These were often enchanted by a priest or a knowledgeable healer, much like how modern times have their own ritualistic practices to cope with stress or insomnia. Perhaps it's no surprise that some scholars argue that these charms created a sense of security and control, turning the dark uncertainty of the night into something slightly less frightening, like a warm blanket of reassurance, woven from faith and magic. In medieval culture, protective rituals extended beyond the sleeping space itself. Some people believed that the first thing they touched upon waking could influence their day, so they might carry a lucky charm in their pocket or a prayer scroll in their sleeve, convinced that these items would continue to shield them even after waking. This carried on the idea that protection wasn't limited to night but a continuous process, an ongoing dance between faith, superstition, and personal security. As you imagine these nightly rituals, remember that they served not only a practical purpose, trying to keep nightmares and evil spirits at bay, but also a deeply psychological one. They helped make sleep a little less mysterious and a little safer, a ritual woven into the very act of surrendering to rest. Perhaps there's a lesson in this, that even in the face of unexplainable fears, human beings have always created their own rituals, their own little spells of comfort, to soothe the restless mind and welcome the night with a sense of divine or magical protection. After all, whether they worked or not, these traditions tell us a lot about how medieval people faced the profound mystery of sleep. By turning to charms, prayers, and the simple human need to feel protected when the world turns dark. As you settle into your medieval imagination, imagine a world where what you eat and drink could mean the difference between a peaceful slumber and a series of restless tosses. Medieval folks believed very strongly that their diet was something to consider carefully before diving into the night, and not just because they might wake up with indigestion, although that was certainly a concern too. First, think about the textures and flavors that would have been common in the Middle Ages. Hearty bread, stews filled with herbs and meat, and a universe of fermented beverages. They believed that what you consumed during the day had a profound influence on your ability to sleep well at night. To start, bread was everything. It was the staple, the backbone of every meal, and in many cases, the only thing standing between someone and hunger. This wasn't the finely sliced bread of today. No, medieval bread was often coarse, dense, and made from whole grains or even rye, which created a feeling of fullness that lingered into the night. Imagine lying down after a hefty slice or two, your stomach grudgingly content but perhaps demanding a little more, whispering that it was not quite ready for rest. And yet, they believed that such filling foods could trap the soul or disturb the sleep. Think of those hearty loaves as the medieval equivalent of a large burrito. Comforting, sure, but capable of causing indigestion if eaten too late or too greedily. Now onto the stews and pottages that simmered over open fires in village hearths. These were not the clear broths you might find in refined kitchens, but thick, chunky, spiced concoctions laden with vegetables, legumes, and sometimes generous cuts of salted or preserved meat. These meals would fill the belly and in many cases contain medicinal herbs supposedly to promote rest, like lavender, mint, or hops, the latter of which is no stranger to modern beer. But in medieval times, it was also thought to help with sleep. They believed that carefully balancing herbs in their dishes could ease the body into a restful state or ward off evil spirits that might disturb the night. And let's not forget that herbs and spices weren't just culinary accessories, but powerful tools in the medieval pharmacopoeia. The rich and the poor alike would add herbs like thyme and rosemary to their meals, partly because they believed they'd keep malevolent sleep demons at bay or help banish nightmares. Imagine finishing a big bowl of stew, feeling both full and fortified, convinced that these herbs would keep you safe from restless spirits lurking under the bed or monsters hiding in the shadows. But diet wasn't just about solid food. Drinks played an even bigger role in controlling or disturbing sleep. The most common beverage was ale, not the crisp, lightly hopped pints we enjoy today, but a more opaque, fermented brew with a lower alcohol content, often consumed at breakfast, lunch, and even with dinner. It was a routine, a wine of the working class that was a staple in households. And yes, some believed it could act as a sleep aid, thanks to its mild sedative effects. Farmers, for example, often drank ale before bed to keep warm and relax through chilly nights. Because, well, brewing beer was easier than heating a bath at that time, however. The alcohol content was likely enough to make a person drowsy. But the truth is, it could also cause restless sleep or wakefulness, especially if consumed in excess. Think of it as a sleep-a-time potion that could backfire. You might drift off easily, but you could also wake up feeling groggy, or worse, with a headache that made counting sheep a genuine challenge. That's why some people prudently limited their evening doses, but others embraced it fully, convinced that a few sips of beer guaranteed a peaceful night, and maybe fewer nightmares. Or so the story went. Medieval herbal concoctions, mead, and compound drinks were also part of their bedtime routine. Scented syrups and infused waters, sometimes flavored with honey and spices, were thought to promote relaxation or divine favor. And of course, the rich would indulge in sweet wines as a treat, which might lull one into a siesta of sorts before the night's rest. But some scholars argue that such drinks, if consumed too generously, could lead to extended waking hours or vivid, unsettling dreams, as alcohol tends to do even today now. Talk about fringe beliefs. There were also recipes for sleep potions that included bizarre ingredients. Imagine a brew with wolf's fang, moonshine, or even ground-up dragon bones, intended to ward off bad dreams and induce restful sleep. These remedies illustrate how eager medieval folk were to manipulate their sleep, often blending superstition with a pinch of herbal wisdom. Some swear by these mixtures, although modern scholars are skeptical. And naturally, the debate continues, with some historians still arguing whether these potions actually worked or were just placebo magic. The tea of the era, if you wanted to call it that, often involved boiling herbs or roots, creating a kind of ancient tisane. They brewed chamomile, which they believed could soothe a troubled mind, and valerian root, which, strangely enough, is still used today as a sleep aid. As you drift into sleep, imagining a cozy mug steaming with herbal goodness, remember that in the Middle Ages, a simple infusion of bitter roots could be a powerful sleep ritual or a talisman against restless spirits. And perhaps both at once. One more quirky detail for your bedtime curiosity. Some medieval texts mention drinking a mixture called sleep water, made from water infused with fragrant herbs, sometimes even sprinkled with holy relic powder, like a pinch of saintly virtue in a cup. As bizarre as it sounds, these concoctions highlight how intertwined food, drink, faith, and superstition were in their bedtime routines. And of course, there's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these magical brews actually had any physiological effect, or simply served as comforting rituals that prepared the mind for sleep. So, in this strange, sumptuous world of medieval diet and drink, you see how the humble meal was a powerful tool, either promoting peaceful sleep or causing restless nights, depending on the ingredients, the timing, or the superstition of the eater. They believed so fervently that what they put into their mouths could literally shape their dreams. And maybe that's why some of their sleep customs seem so odd but oddly charming. And remember, whether it was a hearty loaf, a spicy stew, or a fragrant herbal brew, the medieval approach to sleep was all about balance, sometimes precariously so, like balancing a plate of cheese and bread on your knees during a midnight snack. The enduring question remains: did these diets truly influence their dreams, or was it all just a story they told themselves before drifting off? Historians still argue whether medieval eaten sleep habits had tangible effects, or were simply part of the grand, delicious spectacle of their daily lives. As you settle into the world of medieval slumber, you might imagine a time when sleep was not just a simple nightly routine, but a complex dance of cycles, beliefs, and mysterious awakenings. One of the strangest, and perhaps most fascinating, features of medieval sleep was the phenomenon of midnight awakenings. Yes, those moments when, suddenly and without warning, you find yourself wide awake in the dead of night, mind racing, heart fluttering. Medieval people experienced this quite routinely, and they certainly didn't see it as mere insomnia or a sign of poor health. Instead, it was woven into their understanding of the natural world, spiritual realms, and the very fabric of their daily lives. In those days, folk believed that the night was not solely a time for rest, but a liminal space, an in-between zone where the earthly and divine intersected. So it's hardly surprising that waking up in the middle of the night could bear some deeper meaning. It was not necessarily viewed as a flaw, but as a sign that something was happening, either in your body, your soul, or the universe itself. Historians still argue whether these awakenings were truly caused by physical health issues like indigestion, or whether they were more connected to spiritual or supernatural influences embedded in their worldview. Consider that medieval Europeans often believed in a world teeming with spirits, demons, angels, and other unseen forces. If you suddenly woke up in the dark, it could be interpreted as a sign that supernatural entities were trying to reach you, or perhaps warn you about something. Sometimes, it was thought that during these awakening moments, angels might visit to deliver divine messages or record your deeds. On the flip side, some believed that pesky spirits or malevolent ghosts took advantage of these vulnerable moments, whispering fears into your ear and possibly causing sleepless nights. Therefore, or so they thought, waking at midnight wasn't just a random event but an interaction with unseen worlds. The common explanation among medieval folk was that these nighttime awakenings emerged because the soul was sometimes briefly detached from the body, what they called the dividing of the night soul. When you wake up suddenly, it was believed that your soul was likely exploring or wandering outside your physical form. You might feel a sudden chill or a prickling sensation, which was interpreted as your spiritual self slipping away to visit heaven or hell, depending on your moral standing or the circumstances of your life. It was a vivid, if somewhat spooky, reminder that the body and soul didn't always stay perfectly aligned during sleep. Of course, plenty of practical explanations abounded. They knew that indigestion, which they called bad humors, could disturb sleep, especially if you had eaten too much late in the evening or indulged in heavy, greasy fare. Drinking fermented beverages like ale or mead was common among all classes, and their diuretic effects could wake you up too. They thought that the natural ups and downs of bodily humors and fluids influenced whether you stayed peacefully in bed or found yourself suddenly alert in the small hours. Some scholars argue that the medieval stress on humors hints at an early understanding of disruptions to hormonal balance, though they didn't have the vocabulary for it now. Not everyone's midnight wakings were the same. Some people would awaken in a state of complete calm, feeling refreshed and ready to get up. Others might toss and turn, plagued with anxiety or disturbing visions. As you drift deeper into this era's sleep lore, you'll find that the reasons for waking could be as varied as the stars, if only you could interpret them correctly. Sometimes they believed that external factors like the phases of the moon could influence when you stirred. A full moon, after all, was thought to stir up all kinds of mischief, including disturbing your slumber. Some even thought that the timing of these awakenings had prophetic significance, perhaps predicting good or ill fortune to come. Believe it or not, medieval people also believed that the wakeful period itself was a sacred time, a window when the veil between worlds was thinner. They often kept vigil during these hours, thinking that divine or spiritual guidance was more accessible now. Sometimes they would pray, recite psalms, or listen for signs in the quiet darkness, hoping to catch divine messages or to ward off evil spirits who might be prowling around. They also thought that these moments of wakefulness could be used for reflection or performing small rituals to ensure safety and divine favor. Interestingly, some medieval medical texts suggest that the act of waking up mid-sleep might be a sign of imbalance in the vital spirits, those life forces they believed animated the body. If someone woke frequently at night, it could mean their humors were out of balance or their spiritual health was compromised, which called for remedies like special charms, prayers, or certain foods. The practicing healers of the day might recommend wearing specific amulets or keeping a small relic nearby to protect against restless spirits or harmful influences during these vulnerable hours. In many cases, these awakenings were considered normal rather than pathological. Sleep experts today sometimes compare it to our segmented sleep patterns, an idea that's gaining renewed interest. Some modern scholars suggest that our ancient ancestors might have naturally experienced multiple sleep cycles interrupted by brief periods of wakefulness, much like medieval folk did. In fact, some research indicates that humans are biologically wired for brief episodes of waking at night, which may have been more common before the advent of artificial lighting and modern stress. But in medieval times, waking in the middle of the night was not just biological. It was deeply intertwined with their understanding of the universe and moral order. People believed that these moments could be opportunities for communication with the divine or for recognizing omens, an open line of spiritual communication that needed to be respected. They sometimes kept a candle lit during the night, casting flickering shadows on the walls, believing that darkness could hide spirits waiting to whisper secrets during those brief intervals when you stirred. They even had specific rituals to perform after waking, like crossing themselves, saying a quick prayer, or counting your blessings to ward off evil influences and secure divine protection. Of course, there's the humorous side of it. Imagine waking up, groggy and confused, to the flicker of a candle and the shadowy shapes in your room. They could easily have mistaken an innocent creak in the house or a strange shadow for a lurking witch or demon plotting their midnight mischief. Sometimes those stories grew into the legendary tales of monsters and spirits that haunted village folklore, adding an extra layer of fear or comfort, depending on how they viewed the unseen world. In the end, whether these midnight awakenings were seen as divine messages, spiritual encounters, or simply the result of bodily quirks, one thing remains clear: the medieval mind was deeply attuned to the mysteries of the night. Their wakefulness was not dismissed as a nuisance, but embraced as part of the natural, mystical harmony of life. Sleep, in their view, was not an unbroken, passive state, but a dynamic dance, one that involved waking, dreaming, hearing, and listening to the silent voices of the night. And so, you might say, those midnight hours were not just moments of restlessness, but vital threads woven into the rich tapestry of medieval life, a testament to their beliefs, fears, hopes, and their unending curiosity about the shadowy, enchanting realm of sleep. As you drift into the world of medieval dreams, it's fascinating to realize that sleep wasn't exactly the silent, peaceful oasis we treasure today. Medieval folks often experienced sleep as a much more turbulent, mysterious affair, especially when it came to those curious sleep disturbances that make modern insomniacs feel so comforted by their Netflix binge. Among these disturbances, none are more intriguing or perplexing than somnambulism, commonly known as sleepwalking, and the host of other strange nighttime phenomena that haunted the dreams of our medieval ancestors. Imagine, if you will, a setting without electric lighting, just flickering candles and a tapestry of shadows dancing on the stone walls. It's easy to picture people falling into a deep slumber, only to be jolted awake, or perhaps not awake at all, by strange sights or sounds. Medieval records are full of tales that suggest sleepwalking wasn't a rare anomaly, but perhaps a perceived part of everyday life, woven into the fabric of their nighttime experiences. Historians still argue whether these accounts describe genuine cases of sleepwalking, or if they are merely figured-out explanations for hallucinations and odd behaviors caught in the dark. And given the limited understanding of sleep physiology back then, many of those stories blur the line between scientific fact and superstition now. Believe it or not, medieval folk believed that sleepwalking and other restless sleep disturbances were often caused by spiritual or supernatural factors. If someone was caught wandering the house at night, the common explanation wasn't they forgot to set their alarm. It was usually that the soul was wandering, or perhaps that evil spirits, demons, or spirits of the dead had taken hold of them. These spirits, they believed, could influence a person's mind during sleep, causing them to behave as if possessed or bewildered. Actually, some medieval texts suggest that sleepwalking was considered a sign of divine punishment or a warning from God, especially if it was coupled with other strange behaviors. You might think, well, that's a little dramatic, like accusing someone of being haunted just because they forgot to lock their door. But in a time when illness was often interpreted as divine intervention, it made some sense. And here's a quirky thing. Medieval physicians didn't just dismiss these episodes as supernatural. They also attempted to explain sleepwalking through more natural causes, like dreams, though their understanding of dreams was heavily influenced by religious visions and biblical stories. They believed that during sleep, the soul could leave the body temporarily, causing strange reactions. This idea meshes with the common belief that sleep was a kind of half-death, a temporary separation of the soul from its earthly vessel. So, when someone was caught wandering, it was sometimes seen as their soul wandering where it shouldn't go, and maybe even encountering spirits or spirits pretending to be people they knew. Of course, medieval medicine wasn't all about spirits and divine punishments. There were practical ideas too, like dehydration or indigestion influencing sleep. If someone had a bad diet, the obsession with heavy, fatty foods to power through labor or long nights, perhaps, they might be more prone to turbulent sleep. And it's no surprise that medieval doctors believed that certain humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, had a role in sleep disorders. An imbalance could turn a peaceful nap into a night of restless roaming or inexplicable wakefulness. The stories of sleepwalking are often vivid and bizarre, recounting figures moving through the halls of castles or quietly wandering the village at night. Some tales involve a maid wandering into her lord's chamber, only to be found the next morning utterly baffled as to how she got there. Others involve nobility who claim to see ghostly apparitions or hear strange whispers while sleeping. These events often fueled local legends and myths about haunted houses and cursed lands. The tales might seem spooky, but they also served as a way to explain the inexplicable. When you don't understand the neurology of sleep, every odd behavior at midnight can seem supernatural. Sleep disturbances in medieval times were also linked to the chaotic, often unsettling environment in which people slept. Medieval beds weren't the comfy, memory foam mattresses we have today. Instead, they were often simple wooden frames with straw mattresses or just piled hay. Sometimes, people would sleep in communal beds. Imagine dozens of villagers or family members close enough to hear each other breathe, which could certainly have led to some comings and goings that looked very much like sleepwalking. It's easy to see how the line between normal nocturnal wandering and genuine sleep disorder might have been blurred, especially when witnesses were unable to see what was happening inside the unconscious mind. Another interesting aspect of sleep disturbances was the fear of nocturnal spirits, or night visitors. Medieval people believed that restless spirits or malevolent beings prowled the night, especially around vulnerable sleepers. You might be surprised to learn that even saints' legends occasionally involved waking spirits, visions sent by divine power during sleep. People would set up protective charms or recite prayers against these wandering entities, in hopes of safeguarding against nighttime possessions or errant spirits that might cause someone to behave oddly, including sleepwalking or sleep paralysis. Speaking of paralysis, sleep-related hallucinations, such as the terrifying sensation of being unable to move, also feature prominently in medieval stories. These episodes, often occurring just as one was falling asleep or waking up, could be dismissed as encounters with demonic forces or evil spirits that would sit atop the chest, making it impossible to breathe or speak. Medieval physicians tried to address these evil attacks with prayers, charms, and protective rituals, rather than understanding the neurological causes behind them. To them, these were not simply episodes of sleep paralysis, but direct interactions with demonic or spiritual entities meant to frighten or corrupt. Sleep disturbances weren't always about evil spirits or night terrors. Sometimes the night brought bizarre behaviors, somnambulism being the most famous, coupled with other phenomena like talking in one's sleep, nightmares, and even sleep-related violence. There are stories of people waking up in strange locations, or even claiming to have met saints or prophets in their dreams. Some believe that sleepwalking could be a divine gift, a sign of spiritual insight or prophetic power, though more often, it was seen as a disorder that needed curing in some cases. Medieval folk believed that certain religious practices could influence these disturbances. For instance, they'd perform special prayers or ritual purification before bed, hoping to keep evil spirits at bay. Others would wear charms depicting saints, or sleep with relics tucked under their pillow, thinking divine protection would keep their souls safe from wandering or demonic influence. Some even attributed sleepwalking to curses placed upon them by enemies. So they would try to break these curses with prayer or by seeking the blessing of a local priest. The prevalence of these stories makes it clear that medieval societies took sleep disturbances very seriously, blending natural explanations with supernatural fears. Whether it was a sign of divine favor or a cautionary tale from a ghost story, the idea that the night could hold unknown terrors, up to our own subconscious, was a powerful part of medieval life. Just as they believed in witches, demons, and divine dreams, they also believed that sleep itself could be a portal to the strange, the supernatural, and the mysterious that lurked just beyond waking consciousness. So, next time you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night, wondering if maybe your dreams are trying to tell you something, just remember, medieval folks might have thought that you were being visited by spirits, or perhaps wandering off into a dream world where the rules of time and space didn't quite apply. Sleep, after all, is a strange and wondrous thing, one that has puzzled mankind for centuries. Perhaps that's why we still whisper about it in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the shadows and whispers that dance at the edge of our dreams. As you drift deeper into the medieval night, it's impossible not to notice how religion weaves itself intricately into every fiber of sleep, almost as if bedtime itself was a sacred ritual. Back then, people didn't simply lie down and turn off the lights. Instead, they prepared their minds and spirits through prayers, saintly intercessions, and divine dreams. Believing that sleep was a mystical bridge between the mortal world and the divine, medieval folks carried a firm conviction that their dreams could be messages straight from heaven or from lurking demons, depending on what side of the spiritual coin you were betting on. The idea that dreams were a divine form of communication wasn't just a whimsical thought. It was firmly rooted in the religious worldview that permeated every aspect of life. Historians still argue whether these divine dreams were genuinely prophetic or just vivid nighttime hallucinations, shaped by high fever, dietary choices, or the nervous energy of a life constantly on the brink of peril. Either way, dreaming was a matter of great importance, and saint stories are dotted with such celestial visions. Let's start with prayer, an essential nightly ritual that wasn't just about asking for good dreams, but about creating a spiritual armor before you closed your eyes. People would kneel by their modest beds, fingers intertwined, whispering prayers etched into their minds, and sometimes into papyrus or parchment if they were a bit wealthier or more devout. These prayers often included asking for protection from nocturnal spirits, evil dreams, or that old friend, sleep paralysis, that tricky visitor who sometimes made even the most pious feel like frozen statues. Prayer was seen as a divine shield, a spiritual sunscreen against the chaos of the subconscious, if you will. And then came the saints, those holy figures who served as celestial intermediaries. To the medieval mind, saints were not distant figures locked away in stained glass. They were close enough to whisper into your dreams if you asked correctly. Certain saints, like Saint Christopher or Saint Raphael, especially specialized in protecting travelers or healing the sick, and by extension, calming restless sleepers. People would keep relics or icons near their beds, believing that these sacred objects could invoke saintly intervention during the night. The stories of Saint Joseph guiding visions or Saint Cecilia inspiring musical dreams still echo in folk traditions, hinting that divine influence wasn't confined to waking life. Now, you might think that all these religious precautions created a peaceful night, but think again. There was also a darker aspect to medieval sleep, driven by fears of demonic infiltration or spirits that thrived in the shadows. Many believed that evil spirits lurked just beyond the veil, waiting to tempt or torment the sleeping soul. To guard against this, they would hang charms like crosses or holy texts under the pillow or smear blessed herbs on the bedposts. Some folks thought that if you recited certain psalms, like Psalm 91, the divine words would act as spiritual barriers, warding off evil entities eager to invade your dreams. And perhaps to add a dash of superstition, many believed that divine dreams could reveal warnings or divine messages. So they took dreams very seriously, almost as if they were part of the celestial oracle divine dreams. That special category weren't just random visions, but were considered messages from God or his saints, often detailed and filled with symbolism. A brilliant sunrise might symbolize hope. A lost loved one in a dream could mean divine reassurance or pending news. Priests and monks often kept dream journals to interpret these sacred visions, trying to decode whether they signified divine approval or an impending disaster. Everyone from peasantry to nobility believed that God's message in dreams could influence decisions, from marriage arrangements to battles. Imagine waking up with a clear message from heaven. No pressure, just the fate of entire kingdoms hanging in your subconscious. One of the intriguing debates among scholars is whether these divine dreams were considered dreams at all, more like divine revelations. Some argue that the medieval interpretation blurred the line between waking and sleeping reality, making every dream a potential divine encounter or a test from God. Others believe that these dreams were simply fabrications born out of religious fervor, heightened by the sleep deprivation typical of medieval life, or perhaps influenced by the strange, herbal concoctions they ingested before bed. Yes, medieval sleepers often consumed herbs, some believed to induce prophetic dreams, like mandrake or mugwort. These plants, sometimes considered magical, could distort sleep patterns and amplify dream activity, blurring the line between spiritual and hallucinatory experiences. Religious customs extended beyond just praying and charms. Many households had designated sleep rituals, like reciting certain phrases or having a guardian angel figure present in their minds before shutting their eyes, that they believed would safeguard their sleep and dreams. The act of blessing oneself or making the sign of the cross was common, perhaps as effective as a modern nightlight, but a lot more spiritual. The idea was that divine blessing could attract divine dreams, while warding off suffocating nightmares or demonic visits. Church teachings reinforced these beliefs, often emphasizing the spiritual importance of sleep as a gift from God, a chance for the soul to renew itself under divine watch. Monks and nuns especially concentrated on prayer before sleep, sometimes spending hours saying vigil prayers or chants, believing that these acts would elevate their dreams into visions of divine truth or heavenly insights. Such spiritual preparation blurred the boundary between waking piety and sleep, turning night into a sacred space where divine communication was possible. Even the design of sleeping spaces reflected these beliefs. People might sleep facing east, toward the sunrise and the rising Christ, hoping this orientation would invite divine illumination into their dreams. Some medieval thinkers theorized that the soul left the body during sleep and traveled in visions, an idea that made sleep a vital spiritual voyage rather than just a biological necessity. In art and literature, saints and holy figures frequently appear in dreams, guiding or warning sleepers, highlighting the importance of divine connection during these silent, sacred hours. And let's not forget the lore about divine figures appearing in dreams offering guidance. Whether it was the Virgin Mary providing comfort or angels delivering messages, these stories permeated everyday life. Dreams weren't just personal visages, but part of a broader divine dialogue. Sometimes, a humble dream could lead to a miraculous cure, a new faith, or an important political alliance, emphasizing how deeply interconnected faith and sleep truly were. In sum, medieval sleep was far from the inert, unconscious state we imagine today. It was a spiritual event, a sacred meeting point where the divine touched the mortal, where prayers, saints, relics, and divine dreams intertwined. People believed that sleep granted a reprieve from the earthly realm, offering opportunities for divine communication, protection, and insight, if one had prepared properly, of course. With prayer as their shield and faith as their guide, medieval sleepers entered the night not merely to rest, but to commune with the divine, trusting that through divine dreams, they could receive guidance, warnings, or blessings that might shape their souls, and sometimes even their destinies. Imagine settling into the medieval world, where sleep wasn't just a private act but a communal event, almost like a giant sleepover with lots of strangers. And not everyone was thrilled about the arrangement. You might think that the idea of crashing alone in a cozy, personalized bed is a modern invention. But back then, the idea of a private bedroom was, well, a bit of a luxury reserved for the wealthy or noble classes. For most folks, sleeping was a group effort, often in large shared beds or even sprawled out on communal sleeping platforms. These arrangements weren't just about practicality. They reflected the social fabric, hierarchies, and sometimes superstitions of the time now. Picture yourself in a medieval village, where families sleep together not just out of necessity, but because space was scarce and privacy even scarcer. In many homes, especially peasant dwellings, the dominant sleep setup was a large communal bed, sometimes just a wooden platform topped with a mattress of straw, rushes, or animal hair. These beds could be enormous, large enough to fit an entire family, sometimes even with a few neighbors if the household was big enough, or if there was a special occasion like a festival or harvest feast. The idea was simple: keep everyone warm, safe, and close. Imagine the murmur of voices, the subtle shifting of bodies, and the faint scent of wood smoke, and perhaps a faint whiff of whatever livestock had been snoozing nearby during the day. Interestingly, these large communal beds weren't static. They could change their form depending on the occasion. During colder months, extra blankets or animal pelts would be added, sometimes so thick that movement in bed was almost impossible without disturbing a few sleeping siblings or cousins. And speaking of animals, some households kept cats or even dogs in the same room. Because really, who could resist using a feline alarm clock against mice, especially when heat was a priority? But there's debate among historians about whether having pets in bedrooms was common or an idyllic myth. Some argue it was more about what wealthy lords did to flaunt their status. Regardless, the line between human space and animal space was blurry at best, of course. This wasn't just about warmth or companionship. There was a social hierarchy even in sleep arrangements. Nobility slept in chambers separate from their servants or courtiers, often in four-poster beds draped with heavy velvet or brocade, surrounded by tapestries depicting saints or hunting scenes. These beds weren't just places to sleep. They were symbols of wealth and power. Meanwhile, peasants might have had a simple straw-filled mattress on the ground or a narrow wooden plank bed. Surprisingly, some aristocrats believed that communal sleeping was healthier. After all, since everyone was breathing the same air in the same space, maybe they could synchronize their health or fortune. Or maybe they just thought it would keep everyone from sneaking off to do something mischievous at night. And speaking of mischievous, some scholars think that sharing beds fostered a sense of community, but others claim it could lead to gossip, pranks, or even the odd midnight brawl. a time before Disney movies made sleepovers seem like innocent fun. Now, imagine that you are a peasant child growing up in a busy household where, after a long day of plowing fields, everyone piles onto a communal bed. As the fire dies down and the night settles in, your family's collective breathing becomes a gentle rhythm, the kind that soothes you into sleep, even if you're sharing with 15 siblings or relatives. Of course, this meant that not everyone could sleep peacefully at the same time because disruptions were common. A sudden cry, a fevered child, a roaming animal, or a restless adult could wake everyone up, sometimes sparking a chain reaction of wakefulness. In grander manners, communal sleeping took on a different flavor. Lords and ladies might have their chambers, but even then, servants or attendants occasionally joined the family in shared quarters. Some wealthy households kept slaves or indentured servants sleeping in the same large rooms, often in simple beds or mats rolled up during the day. This arrangement wasn't just about saving space. It was about control and hierarchy. Think of a giant, multi-generational sleep party where everyone knew their place. And on some occasions, entire castles featured large communal beds called covered beds, which could be so massive that dozens of people could fit, somewhat resembling a cozy, albeit chaotic, giant dormitory. But wait, it gets more intriguing. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely preferred sleeping in communal arrangements, or whether it was just a matter of necessity, poor heating, limited space, or social customs. Some believe that these large shared beds fostered a sense of security and unity, especially during uncertain times. Others suggest that privacy, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent, making individual practices almost irrelevant. Perhaps in the end, people were just so used to sharing space that they didn't think twice. But imagine the occasional awkward moment when someone's stubborn foot or restless tossing disturbed the peace. A bit like sharing a hotel room with relatives during a family vacation, but without the benefit of a housekeeping staff. At night, some would even position their beds or sleeping mats in the main hall or common room for warmth and safety, especially in colder months or during times of crisis. The idea of collapsing into your own bed after a long day, well, that was more of an aspiration than a regular practice for many. Instead, people might just settle onto a shared sleeping area and settle into the collective comfort or discomfort of the situation. Their sleep was often interrupted by the clatter of animals, the distant howl of wolves, or the watchman's call for vigilance, meaning even in slumber, they were not far from awareness. In medieval cities, with wood fires crackling and the hum of bustling life outside, sleeping arrangements could be even more communal. Sometimes entire households would sleep in one large, shared chamber with no division at all, just a floor strewn with straw or rushes, with everyone, men, women, children, huddled together for warmth and safety. It's worth noting that some medieval texts describe entire families sleeping in a single bed, not because they fancied sleeping so close, but simply because they didn't have better options. In the end, these arrangements weren't just about practicality. They were woven into the social and cultural fabric. Sleeping in large groups reinforced bonds, kept everyone warm, and perhaps, in some cases, kept the notorious night spirits or the dreaded bogeymen at bay. Since most people didn't have rooms dedicated solely to sleep, the concept of privacy, as we know it today, was almost non-existent. Instead, they embraced the chaos, the closeness, and the unpredictability of their sleeping environments, their collective slumber telling a story about community, hierarchy, and necessity that echoes even in our modern practices, albeit with a far greater emphasis on personal space. And so, as you drift into the gentle night, remember that medieval sleeping arrangements, with their shared beds and crowded chambers, were not just about saving space. They were about living together, sharing fears and warmth in a world where space and privacy were often luxuries, rather than norms. And perhaps, just perhaps, there's a little lesson there about the comfort of community, even if everyone's feet end up in someone's face at 3 a.m. on a cold winter's night. As you drift deeper into the medieval night, your mind might wonder about the strange and often quite bizarre ways folks in those distant centuries tried to coax sleep from the shadows. One of the more fascinating chapters in this story is how medieval society approached sleep medicine and the remedies they believed could cure insomnia, promote restful slumber, or banish nightmares. A topic as layered as a well-stacked pie, filled with herbs, potions, and mystical beliefs. Perhaps surprisingly, medieval medicine was a curious mix of the scientific, the superstitious, and the downright strange, with folk remedies often hanging on the edge of both plausibility and pure magic. Imagine a dark, flickering chamber, where an apothecary or folk healer, cloaked in a faded robe, prepares what they call a sleep potion, an infusion of herbs and strange ingredients, hoping to soothe the restless mind. The core of medieval sleep remedies often depended on a robust belief in the healing powers of herbs and natural substances. For example, valerian root was a well-known sedative even back then. Its dried roots would be brewed into an herbal tea in hopes of calming nerves and inducing sleep. The Romans had praised valerian for its sleep-inducing properties, and medieval healers carried that tradition forward, confident that this hardy root could ease a restless soul. In addition to valerian, the medieval remedy chest overflowed with herbs like lavender, chamomile, lemon balm, and passion flower, all believed to have calming effects. Picture a breathtaking mixture of dried herbs boiling gently in a pot, filling the air with aromas that would make modern aromatherapists swoon. These herbal brews weren't just for the elderly. Even anxious knights and worried villagers turned to these natural sedatives, which they thought could keep nightmares at bay or soothe away the anxieties of a harsh world. But it wasn't only herbs that played a role. Medieval medicine leaned heavily on the mystical, mixing herbs with charms, talismans, and a dash of superstition. For example, some remedies included charms inscribed with sacred symbols, believed to ward off evil spirits that might invade your dreams or cause insomnia. Imagine mumbling a prayer while sipping on a potion, with the hope that divine intervention would grant you peaceful sleep. Sometimes, they would hang amulets near the bed, like a tiny charm of scent. Raphael, the angel said to heal and protect travelers, and hoped that the protective aura would allow you to drift into sleep unmolested. The use of magical ointments was also common. Greasy, pungent mixtures often made with herbs, animal fats, and even minerals like sulfur or arsenic. Yes, arsenic, because in medieval medicine, a little poison was sometimes thought to be good for a good night's rest, or so they claimed. These ointments would be rubbed into the skin or applied near the bed to banish restless spirits or evil influences that were believed to cause insomnia or disturbing dreams. Of course, many of these remedies were not purely herbal or magical. They also involved intricate recipes that combined multiple ingredients in ways that boggle the modern mind. Some folk cures demanded you boil up a mixture of crushed skull bones, dried toadstools, or even ground-up fish scales. Ingredients that, unless you're a fan of very strange sushi, would make you wince today. Remember that cat's whiskers or the milk of a black hen might also be part of a sleep potion, illustrating just how entwined daily life, superstition, and medicine were in medieval times. Scholars dispute whether the medieval medical community truly believed in these potions, or if they were more symbolic gestures, kind of like wearing mismatched socks for good luck. Historians still argue whether these remedies actually worked, or simply served as placebo, comfort, or cultural ritual. Still, the overarching belief was that combining herbal remedies with spiritual protections created a sleep environment more likely to bring repose and peace. Sometimes, These remedies extended to dietary advice that aimed to improve sleep quality. For instance, the consumption of warm milk was a common practice, milk being a source of tryptophan, an amino acid that boosts serotonin and promotes relaxation. It's like the medieval version of curling up with a sleep-a-time tea, minus the fancy marketing labels, of course. Yet some decided that milk was too mundane and opted to add honey, spices, or even a dash of local wine to enhance its soothing effect. Turning their bedtime drink into a mini potion. Medieval folk also believed that certain foods could cause nightmares if consumed late at night. So they warned against eating heavy meats, spicy foods, or salted fare close to bedtime, thinking those would upset the stomach and stir the spirits. Instead, they favored lighter fare, perhaps a few soaked figs or a little almond paste, foods thought to promote gentle sleep rather than animated nightmares. These notions hint at an understanding, however primitive, of how diet influences sleep, a concept that modern science is only now catching up to. The use of alcohol as a sleep aid was a double-edged sword. A little wine or mead might help you drift off more easily, but too much could awaken you in the middle of the night with a pounding headache, perhaps the medieval equivalent of a hangover nightmare. Yet, in a society where spirits and fermented drinks were woven into daily life, it's no surprise that mead and ale frequently made appearances in bedtime routines, often infused with herbs or spices for added effect. Midnight awakenings, often seen as part of the natural sleep cycle, became a focus of folk remedies. Those strange, sometimes poetic practices meant to keep spirits at bay or restore sleep. For example, some believed that a piece of bread or a small amount of salt placed under the pillow could absorb malevolent energies, acting as a barrier between your dreams and the restless spirits prowling in the dark. Others would recite short prayers or charms upon awakening, trying to remember divine words that would send nightmares scattering. In some places, they even employed charms that involved repetitive incantations or singing lullabies at midnight, believing that the power of sound and rhythm could coax sleep back when it had been lost. Unlike today's sleep aids, which come in pills and pills only, medieval remedies combined physical ingredients with mental discipline, an early recognition that the mind, just as much as the body, needed soothing. Interestingly, the use of specific plants for dreamless sleep was quite common. Things like mugwort or deadly nightshade, which had a reputation for producing dreams or even blackouts. These plants were dangerous, though often toxic or hallucinogenic, which shows just how far medieval remedies sometimes went in pursuit of a good night's sleep. They were experimenting with potent substances, setting the stage for the later development of complex pharmacology, even if some of their early experiments had unintended and colorful side effects. And of course, the practitioners of these remedies, quacks, wise women, monks, and herbalists, often kept detailed manuals or scrolls filled with recipes, warnings, and spells. Some of these texts looked more like potion recipes for witches' brews, completely inscrutable to the untrained eye, while others were earnest medical texts filled with Latin and herbal diagrams. Now, historians debate whether these texts reflect genuine medical knowledge, or if they are simply cultural artifacts that illustrate how medieval society understood the body, spirits, and the mysterious realm of sleep. Through all the strange ingredients and mystical practices, it's clear that medieval sleep remedies weren't just about fixing an insomniac night. They reflected a worldview where health was intrinsically connected to spirituality, luck, and cosmic forces. Whether brewed from herbs, blessed with prayer, or protective charms, these remedies reveal a world where sleep was fragile, magical, and worth fighting for with the divine and the mundane alike. And so, as you listen to the gentle hum of the world outside your window, remember that long ago, people weren't just tossing and turning. They were concocting potions, chanting spells, and hanging talismans in a brave, if sometimes eccentric, attempt to tame the restless night. Perhaps, in some strange way, Their hopes and fears echo through the remedies we dismiss as kooky today, reminding us that sleep has always been a precious and mysterious gift, forever worth battling legends, potions, and the dark itself to hold on to. As night falls over the medieval world, a different kind of darkness begins to creep in, not just the absence of light, but a blanket of fears and superstitions that wrap around your sleeping mind like a thick, itchy wool cloak. Tonight, let's delve into the strange, sometimes spooky, often fascinating world of nighttime fears. Those monsters, spirits, and protective rituals that medieval folk believed kept the darkness at bay. Picture the scene. Your humble chamber, flickering candlelight dancing across rough stone walls, the faint aroma of herbs and baked bread lingering in the air. But amid the gentle hum of nocturnal life, a darker thought might cross your mind. Medieval people often believed that the night was a battleground, a place where good and evil clashed, where spirits and monsters lurked just beyond the edge of perception. These fears weren't just casual worries like how to stay dry or avoid a draft. They were woven into the very fabric of their nightly existence, stitched through stories, superstitions, and rituals that were as essential as their prayers or their chores. Let's begin with those nightly fears of monsters, a category that included everything from mischievous goblins to much more sinister entities. The medieval mind often pictured monsters as lurking just out of sight, perhaps behind a darkened curtain or beneath the bed. Tales told of beasts with claws and teeth, of creatures with multiple eyes, or of shadowy figures with glowing eyes who would snatch children or wander the woods. Historians still argue whether these stories served as allegories for societal anxieties or simply as a way to keep children safely under the covers. For example, many medieval children's stories warned of terrifying beasts that could snatch them if they dared to stray too far from home, kind of an early version of today's stranger danger, just with more claws and grumpy trolls. But what about the spirits? Ah, yes. It was widely believed that spirits of the dead, restless souls, or even divine messengers, roamed the night. Some of these spirits were benevolent, like guardian angels watching over you, while others were quite the opposite, malevolent, vengeful, or just plain mischievous. The idea of spirits was so embedded that many homes had specific rituals to either welcome these spirits or keep dangerous ones away. For example, leaving small offerings or lighting candles meant to guide good spirits or ward off evil ones. The notion of spirits being active at night also explains why many people slept with their beds near an open window or with a single eye open, listening for signs of spectral disturbances. Now, in the medieval imagination, spirits weren't just about ghosts or ancestors. They also included spirits of nature and supernatural entities drawn from pagan traditions, often blended with Christian beliefs. Some believed that spirits inhabited the forests, lurking behind trees, whispering secrets, or causing mischief. Others thought that certain trees or stones were imbued with spirits that could influence your sleep, sometimes bringing dreams, sometimes nightmares. This mix of pagan and Christian thought created a rich tapestry of nocturnal fears that varied regionally, but often overlapped. One fascinating part of medieval superstition revolved around the idea of mischievous night spirits called fairies or elves. These tiny, capricious beings weren't monsters in the sense of terrorizing directly, but their whims could disturb sleep. If you left a morsel of bread on your windowsill at night, some believed the fairies might take it, leaving behind mischief instead. They were thought to be playful, but their pranks could also be mischievous to the point of causing serious sleep disturbances, like hiding objects or tugging at your hair while you snoozed. Of course, across all these fears, protective rituals emerged to safeguard sleepers from the unseen horrors of the night. Imagine being in a dark room, clutching a charm or blessing a bed with holy water to ward off the monsters and spirits. Many households kept amulets made of herbs, stones, or carved wooden charms designed to repel evil spirits. Some believed that praying a specific prayer or reciting a protective rhyme before bed could banish any lurking spirits or monsters. For instance, the famous cleansing of the bed ritual involved sprinkling holy water, ringing bells, and uttering blessings because, to medieval folk, silence and holy words could create a barrier between the waking world and the supernatural threats beyond. And let's not forget the role of the church, or more specifically, the prayers to saints believed to have powers over nightmares and evil spirits. Saints like Saint Michael or Saint Christopher were called upon to guard against demonic entities snatching souls or tormenting sleepers. Stories abound of devout individuals sleeping with relics under their pillow, or reciting the Our Father or Hail Mary repeatedly, hoping divine protection would lull the monsters away. Some believed that the divine could manifest in dreams. A saint or angel might appear in a dream to warn or protect, turning an otherwise frightening night into a divine message or a moment of spiritual reassurance. Now, let me share a quirky tidbit. Some medieval protective rituals involved more unusual items. For example, hanging a pomegranate outside the window was thought to ward off evil spirits, or placing a handful of salt under the bed to absorb malicious energies. Salt, after all, in many ancient cultures, was a universal symbol of purity and protection. Imagine the ancient equivalent of leaving a bowl of popcorn by the bed to keep the spectral monsters at bay. Hey, if it works for popcorn breath, perhaps it kept away the goblin breath too. Since the medieval worldview was a mixture of deep Christian faith, older pagan traditions, and a healthy dose of superstition, fears of monsters and spirits created a landscape of nightly caution. People endured sleepless nights, or at least restless ones, carefully setting up their protective charms, reciting prayers, and lighting candles to keep the evil at bay. They believed that sleep was fragile, vulnerable to both physical threats like cold and damp, and these invisible supernatural ones. Perhaps that's why sleep was often seen not just as a biological necessity, but as something precarious, an important part of life that needed defending. This is also why bedtime stories often included tales of monsters and spirits. They prepared children and adults, too, for the dangers lurking in the shadows. These stories served as warnings wrapped in tales of bravery, caution, and divine justice. Sometimes these fears got so entrenched that entire rituals would be performed nightly without question, turning the act of going to sleep into a kind of spiritual battle. Imagine, if you will, a chamber lit only by candlelight, beads of sweat on your brow, whispering those protective prayers while clutching your lucky charm. Because in a world where darkness could conceal monsters with fierce claws, the best defense really was a mixture of faith, superstition, and a good dose of cautious paranoia. As the centuries passed, some of these fears softened or transformed. Monsters faded into legend, spirits became more benign, and the rituals evolved. But the core idea persisted. The night was a mysterious, sometimes dangerous realm that needed respect and care. Today, most of us sleep soundly, blissfully unaware of the spectral armies or monster patrols that once haunted the medieval mind. But these fears remind us how deeply humans have always tried to tame the darkness, sometimes with charms, sometimes with prayers, and often with stories that have echoed through history. And you see, even now, that lingering idea that darkness hides unknown terrors doesn't entirely fade. We might not believe in goblins or spirits wandering around our bedrooms, but perhaps we still leave a small nightlight or a favorite stuffed animal nearby, modern equivalent of charms and prayers, to feel a bit safer. Because deep down, whether in medieval castles or suburban bedrooms, the human heart is never quite ready to welcome total darkness without a little reassurance. So next time you find yourself drifting off, remember those brave souls who faced their fears with charms, prayers, and a pinch of superstition. And maybe, just maybe, they got a little more sleep because of it. As shadows lengthen and the stars begin to flicker overhead, the bedtime stories of medieval folks weave a fascinating tapestry of tales, legends, and cultural narratives that echo through history. These stories weren't just bedtime fluff. They carried deep meanings, moral lessons, and explanations for the mysterious and often inexplicable events that plagued their restless nights. When you drift into imagining medieval sleep, you might picture a world where monsters lurked under the bed. But in reality, the folklore surrounding sleep was rich with symbolism, superstitions, and fears, an intricate web spun from the minds of people trying to make sense of their nightly experiences. In medieval times, sleep wasn't viewed as a simple biological necessity, but a state infused with spiritual significance. People believed that what happened during sleep could influence their waking lives, and many stories grew around this idea. For example, the notion that dreams could be divine messages was widespread. Saints often appeared in dreams to send guidance or warnings, and the lines between reality and divine communication could blur into the realm of legend. These divine dreams weren't just personal, they often carried collective meanings, reinforcing social hierarchies and religious values. Imagine a time when dreaming of a saint could mean divine favor, while dreaming of a demon might suggest evil spirits trying to influence your soul. Kind of like the medieval version of a haunted house, but inside your own mind. Many of the folk stories about sleep revolved around monsters, spirits, and supernatural beings that wandered the night. Think of the terrifying tales of night monsters like the known or unknown creatures that supposedly haunted dark forests and shadowy corners of the village. These weren't just stories to scare children. Well, perhaps they were, but they had serious implications. People believed that spirits and demons could intrude upon your sleep, causing nightmares or even sleep paralysis, a mysterious state where you're awake but unable to move, which was often chalked up to malevolent supernatural activity. It's easy to see why folks relied on such tales. If your night was filled with ghastly visions, wouldn't you want a story or charm to keep those spirits at bay? The notion of protective charms and talismans was intrinsically woven into nocturnal folklore. People would hang amulets, saints' medals, and even bizarre objects like animal teeth or bits of root over their beds, believing they guarded them from evil spirits that could prey on the vulnerable during their sleep. These charms were often accompanied by prayers and incantations, reflecting a worldview where supernatural forces were as real as the diseases they tried to fend off. It's funny, when you think about it, how much effort went into warding off unseen night forces. Imagine a medieval sleepover with amulets and relics hanging above your head like a DIY horror-themed decor. Now, it's worth noting that many of these stories weren't just for superstition's sake. They served social functions too. Tales of monsters lurking in the night reinforced communal boundaries, warning outsiders or unruly children to stay within their roles. They also created a shared cultural identity, passed down through generations, reinforcing religious values and societal norms. For example, the story of the midnight demon who tried to steal souls might have served as a moral reminder to stay devout and obedient, since the demon only visited those with wavering faith or sinful habits. It's a bit like the medieval equivalent of the boogeyman warning, but with more theological flair. Folklore about sleep also included stories of divine apparitions, visions and dreams that featured saints, angels, and sometimes Jesus himself. These stories often reinforced the idea that sleep was a portal to the divine realm. People would spend nights praying fervently before sleep, hoping to be visited by a saint or given a heavenly message during their dreams. Some tales narrate how saints appeared in dreams to grant miraculous cures or guidance, whispering secrets of the universe or a forecast of coming events. If you've ever had a vivid dream and woke up convinced it was a message from above, you're actually in good medieval company. These divine dreams elevated sleep into a sacred experience, making it a bridge between mortal life and the divine. Rather than mere unconsciousness, cultural narratives weren't just about divine or demonic visitors. They also involved moral stories. For example, a common folk tale might tell of a repentant sinner who, during their sleep, was visited by a ghost warning of impending doom unless they reformed their ways. Such stories served as moral lessons, urging people to lead virtuous lives in the hope of righteous dreams or divine favor. Conversely, tales warning against immoral behavior often portrayed restless spirits or vengeful ghosts who haunted those who strayed from the moral path. These stories reinforced a moral structure, warning that your midnight dreams could be a punishment or reward based on your earthly actions. Medieval people also believed that their dreams could tell them about the future, a concept known as prophecy through dreams. This belief was so widespread that kings and rulers often consulted dream interpreters to understand omens seen during sleep. For example, a dream about a flock of ravens might portend war, or a vision of a serene landscape could suggest peace after turmoil. While modern scholars tend to think these interpretations are mostly coincidence or wishful thinking, in medieval society, they were taken very seriously. Some stories even recount how ordinary folk received messages from spirits or angels in their sleep, guiding decisions from mundane to momentous. It's as if everyone from peasants to princes carried a dream diary, hoping the nocturnal tales would influence their waking fate. Interestingly, these nighttime tales didn't vanish with the end of the medieval period. They evolved into folklore and urban legends we hear today. Many modern horror stories borrow heavily from medieval motifs: the haunted bedroom, the sleep demon, or the vivid nightmare as divine warning. While haunted houses are now mostly theme parks or Halloween attractions, the medieval stories of waking up terrified after ghostly visits still influence our cultural imagination. Perhaps that's why sleep is still a little mysterious and a little thrilling. We're still inheriting stories shaped centuries ago by people just like you and me, trying to sleep through the night without being possessed by spirits or eaten by monsters. And then there's the question of what wasn't necessarily just folklore, but also part of their cultural narrative. Stories that explained the inexplicable and comforted those trembling under the covers. Tales of divine dreams inspired by saints or angels, warning spirits, or demonic entities weren't all just tall tales. They were part of a worldview where the boundary between the physical and spiritual was blurred. Sleep was a domain where heaven and hell, virtue and vice, the natural and supernatural intersected, creating a landscape of legends that shaped the very thoughts and fears of medieval folk. In the end, these stories and superstitions about sleep serve as a mirror of medieval society's hopes, fears, and beliefs. They remind us how much humans have always looked to stories, whether to scare away the monsters under the bed or to find meaning in the silent hours of the night. As you settle down to sleep, think of the countless generations before you who lay awake pondering stories of ghostly visitors, divine messages, and midnight monsters, all trying to make sense of the mysterious, shadowy world just beyond the veil of dreams. And perhaps, in some strange way, those stories still whisper to us today, guiding our own dreams and fears within the quiet darkness. In the medieval world, your sleep wasn't just a matter of lying down and closing your eyes. It was intricately tied to your social standing, your environment, and your very identity within the community. For some, a cozy, private bed in a warm chamber was a symbol of wealth, while others, perhaps peasants or laborers, found themselves sleeping in shared spaces that blurred the lines between rest and communal survival. Your social status, whether you were a noble in velvet and silk or a serf wrapped in rough wool, shaped the very nature of your sleep. subtly dictating comfort levels, sleep quality, and even the rituals that accompanied your nightly repose. Imagine slipping between fine linen sheets embroidered with gold thread. Your chamber illuminated softly by candles, or even the flickering glow of a hearth, warm and private, reserved just for you. This was the luxury of the upper classes, who had the privilege of privacy, personal beds, and custom-made mattresses stuffed with goose down or luxurious straw. Nobles believed that comfort in sleep was comparable to comfort in life, and so their sleeping quarters became sanctuaries, often located in the upper stories of castles or manors, protected from the chaos of the outside world. The wealthy used fluffy feather beds, sometimes so thick that they seemed almost to swallow the sleeper, and decorated their sleeping chambers with rich tapestries, plush carpets, and personal valuables. For them, sleep wasn't just rest. It was a symbol of status, a way to show their wealth without even speaking a word. Meanwhile, for the lower classes, peasants, laborers, and craftsmen, sleep was a more communal affair. Their beds weren't the four-poster masterpieces of the aristocracy, but simple wooden platforms or hay-filled cradles, often shared among family members or even neighbors, especially during harsh winters when everyone huddled together for warmth. The idea of privacy would have been almost laughable to them. There are records suggesting that entire families sometimes slept in the same large bed, with children tangled in the same blankets as their parents. The rougher, dirtier conditions, think of a shared barn-comb bedroom, meant that comfort was secondary to survival and social connection. But it wasn't just about comfort or location. Social status also affected the quality of sleep through access to supplies, like herbs, aromatic oils, and warm clothing. That could help you sleep more peacefully or keep away malevolent spirits you believed haunted the night. Wealthier folk could afford to have a personal chaplain or a dedicated servant tasked with preparing their rooms or reciting prayers to chase away restless spirits. The less fortunate relied on superstition, charms, or even simple routines like burning certain herbs or reciting their own prayers, often in a communal setting, which inherently meant their sleep was sometimes disturbed by the noise and activity of others. It's tempting to think that all medieval beds, regardless of social status, shared similar features. But the truth is that the disparities were stark. Nobles might have had rooms so spacious that they could have scattered a dozen beds within, each one tailored to the sleeper's needs. Some constructed of fine oak, others of decorated stone, with hanging drapes or privacy curtains to block out the cold or prying eyes. Peasants, on the other hand, might have had just a thin mattress stuffed with straw or moss, or simply a pile of hay, with no curtains or privacy at all, just a rough spot to lean back against. The difference in comfort was glaring, especially knowing that the wealthy could indulge in snug, therapeutic sleeping environments, while the poor had to settle for practicality, if they could find a bed at all. And let's not forget that social hierarchy even influenced when and how people slept. Nobility often adhered to fixed routines, going to bed after evening prayers and waking with the dawn, timing that was regulated by liturgical hours, while laborers or farmers might sleep in shorter, fragmented segments, waking at night to perform chores or tend to animals. This pattern later became classified as divided sleep, but you can imagine that for the lower classes, this was very much a matter of necessity dictated by light, work, and available resources. This stratification meant that sleep could also serve as an expression of social distance, reinforcing class boundaries. The very arrangement of sleeping spaces often marked the social hierarchy, with the wealthy's beds situated in private chambers far from the noisy, crowded quarters of servants, while the less privileged shared communal spaces just to stay warm. There was a certain psychological comfort. If you could afford your own bed, you could also afford the luxury of restful sleep, free from the inevitable disruptions of communal life. Conversely, sharing a cramped space could mean restless nights, with noises, disturbances, and the constant awareness that your comfort was second to the survival needs of your family or community. Interestingly, scholars still argue whether this social stratification in sleep was as rigid as it seems. Some suggest that during times of hardship, even the wealthy may have been forced to sleep in more humble conditions, sharing space with family members, or sliding into shared beds to conserve heat or resources. Alternatively, some argue that the concept of private sleeping chambers was more symbolic than practical, especially in times of plague or war, when everyone's sleeping arrangements had to adapt quickly. The social status at play in medieval sleep also extended to the rituals associated with bedtime. Nobles might have had personal attendants to help with dressing, winding down, or ensuring their clothes and bedding were perfectly arranged, each detail an outward sign of their societal position. The poor, meanwhile, relied more on practical routines, squeezing into whatever space was available, performing brief prayers or charms before sleeping, and trusting in the protective magic or divine intervention to keep away spirits or evil eyes. It's interesting to wonder if they ever looked at the wealthier neighbors and envied their plush beds and private chambers, or if they considered their communal, no-frills sleeping arrangements as a mark of resilience and solidarity. All of these factors combined created a rich tapestry of sleeping life in medieval times, where your social status was almost inscribed on your bed, your environment, and even your sleep patterns. Whether you slept in a silk-lined, four-poster bed or on a shared haystack with your family, your experience was a reflection of your place in the medieval social order. It's almost poetic. Your sleeping habits, so often private and personal today, were for them a statement of belonging, a ritual that reinforced the social fabric. And somewhere in all of this, the line between comfort, necessity, and social status wove a complex pattern that shaped sleep itself into an invisible marker of medieval rank. When you consider the incredible disparities, yet the universal need to rest and dream, that defined medieval sleep, it's clear that beneath the surface of simple bedtime routines lay a social mosaic so intricate that it still makes modern sleep studies look like a game of tic-tac-toe. It's a reminder that even in the quiet darkness of night, society's deepest structures continue to cast their shadows, shadows that stretch through time and into the very way we sleep today. The echoes of medieval sleep customs still ripple subtly through the fabric of our modern lives, even if we rarely stop to notice. When you think about how people in castles, cottages, and monasteries slumbered centuries ago, you might not realize how deeply their nighttime routines have influenced what we do today. Whether consciously or through the quiet transmission of habits and beliefs that have lingered like a faint perfume, these ancient practices, often shaped by a mixture of necessity, superstition, and tradition, have left their mark on the way we approach sleep, comfort, and even our dreams. Take, for example, the idea of divided sleep, a concept that may seem downright peculiar but was once quite common. Historically, people didn't lie down and sleep straight through the night as many modern sleep studies suggest we should. Instead, they experienced a two-phase sleep pattern with a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During this interlude, sometimes lasting an hour or more, they might get up to pray, meditate, read, or even perform household chores. This divided sleep isn't just a quirky relic. It aligns with some findings from modern sleep research, which suggests that our ancestors' natural circadian rhythms may have included these periods of wakefulness, evidence that perhaps the modern 8-hour sleep stretch is more a cultural invention than a biological mandate. Yet for centuries, people believed waking up in the middle of the night was a sign of spiritual or supernatural disturbance, a ghostly sign perhaps, or a warning of some mischief in the dark. Imagine the medieval mind, unsettled by the shadows cast by a flickering candle, convinced that spirits or witches might be lurking just beyond the candle's glow. Night watchmen were another piece of this atmospheric puzzle. In medieval towns and castles, these vigilant guardians patrolled streets and ramparts, keeping the darkness at bay. Their presence contributed to a broader societal rhythm, an unspoken understanding that someone was awake while others slept. Oddly enough, this societal structure may have influenced sleep patterns outside of the Watchmen's beat. Some scholars argue that the shared consciousness of continuous vigilance created a collective culture of divided sleep, where waking during the night was, in a way, normalized. You could say that the very fabric of medieval nightly life was stitched with the idea that sleep was a communal act, punctuated by the watchman's call or the church bells ringing midnight. And unsurprisingly, the idea of nocturnal vigilance cemented itself into folk stories about protective spirits and night monsters, giving rise to a wealth of folklore about shadows that moved and monsters hiding just beyond the firelight, speaking of the nighttime environment. Medieval bedrooms weren't the plush beds with memory foam that many of us now adore. Instead, beds could be simple wooden frames, sometimes shared by families or animals, an intimate, if somewhat less sanitized, version of modern sleeping arrangements. The rooms were typically drafty, lit by flickering candles or oil lamps, which cast dancing shadows that could spark the imagination. And beds, often just straw mattresses topped with rough linen sheets, hardly the plush cocoon you might picture today. The idea of a personal sanctuary was more a matter of social standing than comfort. Aristocrats enjoyed finer linens, heated beds, and privacy, while common folk squeezed into shared spaces, where sleep was a communal act as much as a personal necessity. Context influenced comfort. If you were wealthy enough, your sleep might involve fragrant herbs tucked into your pillow, intended to ward off evil spirits or encourage restful dreams, lingering as remnants of medieval superstitions that believed odors could influence both sleep quality and spiritual safety. Charming dreams, divine visions, and superstitions played their part in shaping the way people prepared for sleep. Medieval folks believed that certain charms, prayers, or relics could influence their dreams or ward off nightmares. For instance, some would hang amulets of saints or saints' bones near their beds, hoping divine favor would seal their sleep from demonic intrusion. Sleep rituals could include reciting psalms, crossing oneself, or even whispering blessings over the bed. Think of these acts as medieval version of a goodnight kiss, only instead of a gentle peck, you're employing a prayer to keep supernatural trouble at bay. These rituals weren't just superstition. They reflected the central role of religion in everyday life, including the quiet, vulnerable act of sleeping. The belief that divine forces could influence dreams or that saints could intercede during the night fueled a rich tradition of spiritual bedtime practices. Diet played an understated but significant role in medieval sleep as well. Medieval diets were often heavy on bread, ale, and herbs, substances that could soothe or disturb depending on their nature and timing. Drinking ale or mead in the evening was common. Though it might seem counterintuitive, alcohol's sedative effects were understood in a loose way, helping people fall asleep faster. However, it could also cause restless sleep and vivid dreams. Certain herbs, like lavender or rosemary, were thought to promote restful sleep and ward off nightmares. Some ascribed mystical properties to foods like onions and garlic, warning that they could cause nightmares or restless slumber. Perhaps an early version of the modern notion that spicy foods might give you odd dreams. And let's not forget that medieval physicians believed that overeating or drinking excessive amounts of certain beverages could disturb the delicate balance of humors, leading to poor sleep or bad humors. As they called it, midnight awakenings were not simply an oddity, but an accepted part of the night's rhythm. Medieval people believed that waking in the middle of the night could be a sign of divine communication, spiritual unrest, or an indication of some imbalance needing correction. Some thought that waking up was the time for prayer, to converse with God or a saint, allowing the soul to reflect and prepare for the morning's labors. Others believed that spirits or demons thrived when humans were vulnerable and awake at these hours, so protective charms and prayers would be employed to keep such entities at bay. The midnight hour was seen as a liminal space, neither fully alive nor truly asleep, where the boundaries between worlds were thinner. Families often kept vigil, whispering prayers or reciting scripture during these hours, turning the act of waking into a spiritual opportunity rather than a disturbances like somnambulism or sleepwalking fascinated many medieval thinkers. They didn't understand the neurological basis of these episodes, but believed such states to be supernatural or divine in nature. It was common to think that sleepwalkers were possessed or under the influence of spirits, especially if they performed strange or dangerous actions while outside of conscious control. Some believed that sleepwalking was a form of divine discharge, or a sign of a troubled soul seeking healing through bizarre dreams or nocturnal wandering. The fear of these wandering souls led to protective rituals, like placing holy objects in bedrooms or drawing protective symbols on the walls. Interestingly, some texts describe medieval diagnosis of sleep disorders, equating them with spiritual afflictions, an interesting intersection of medicine and mysticism, as they sought cures through exorcism, blessings, or herbal remedies. Religious influences weaved seamlessly into the fabric of sleep culture. Prayers before sleep were standard, and images of saints or divine visions were thought to bring restful nights. Saints' relics were kept under pillows or on bedside tables, thought to provide divine protection. Many believed that divine dreams, visions granted by God, could reveal important messages or prophecy, and some would keep a prayer journal or dream book to record these nocturnal revelations. The divine and the supernatural intertwined so completely that a good night's rest was seen not just as an act of physical recovery, but as a spiritual blessing. For the devout, sleep was a sacred act, an opportunity for divine communication and reflection. Sleeping arrangements ranged from communal family beds shared with children or animals to private chambers for the wealthy. The communal style of sleeping fostered a sense of security. Family members or servants could listen for danger or illnesses and wake in time to help. For aristocrats or those of higher social standing, the decadent bedding, with silk hangings and fine linens, turned sleep into an art form, a display of wealth and comfort. These luxury beds often had canopies, which served both as protection from drafts and as a status symbol. The size and quality of one's sleeping space reflected social hierarchy, an early version of the luxury bedding trend we see today in hotel suites. In some cases, bedrooms doubled as social spaces, where stories were whispered and dreams shared, creating a nighttime culture rooted in communal trust and social stratification. Medieval sleep medicine was infused with the mystical and the herbal, often aimed at restoring harmony to the humors or dispelling spiritual disturbances. People relied on herbal teas, potions, and charms, things like mandrake root or various herbs thought to induce sleep or ward off nightmares. Sometimes, priests or wise women employed exorcisms or blessings, believing that restless spirits needed to be expelled from a person's sleep space. The use of charms, such as knots or spoken incantations, was common, designed to trap or ward off malevolent spirits. Surprisingly, some medieval sleep aids were quite sophisticated. They used scents like lavender or rosemary, believed to calm the mind and promote sleep, a practice still appreciated in aromatherapy today. Other remedies involved placing blessed objects under the pillow or around the bed's perimeter, reinforcing the deep connection between spirituality and health. Nighttime fears remained ever present. Tales of monsters lurking in the shadows, spirits seeking entry, or demons tempting sleepers were common themes spun into scarlet threads of medieval folklore. Protective rituals, such as crossing oneself before bed or drawing symbols on the wall, became daily routines to keep these fears at bay. The idea of evil spirits or restless souls wandering was so pervasive that entire cultures developed a rich armor of superstitions, charms, and prayers to defend against such nightly threats. These fears weren't just superstitions, but reflections of a worldview that saw the night as a liminal space fraught with dangers, spiritual, physical, or both. These fears also sparked a treasure trove of folklore, stories of creatures like the midnight mare, evil spirits, or the dreaded owl, a kind of malevolent nymph, which served both as cautionary tales and as magical protections. Folklore and stories about sleep, tales that included secret rituals to see prophetic dreams or avoid nightmares, formed a vital part of medieval culture. Dream interpretive guides, often written by scholars or monks, offered detailed explanations of what different dreams might mean, turning sleep into a narrative adventure. Many cultures held that dreams could be divine messages or warnings, and so, people fashioned stories about waking spirits, enchanted beds, or cursed slumber. These stories served as cultural narratives, ways to explain the mysterious, comforting, or terrifying aspects of sleep, blurring the line between the spiritual and the literal. From tales of witches entering sleep to steal souls, to stories of divine visions during sacred rest. The bedroom was a tiny universe of stories woven into the fabric of everyday life. Social status heavily influenced how people experienced sleep, from the quality of their bedding to their privacy and comfort. In medieval times, wealth and power meant better, more luxurious beds, often with multiple layers of fine linens, silk coverings, and ornate woodwork. The higher your rank, the more your sleep environment symbolized your status. Think of grand four-poster beds draped with velvet and gold embroidery. For the less fortunate, sleep was a matter of survival, often cramped and shared, with little regard for comfort. Yet even these conditions had their own rituals to keep away spirits and ensure safety. The wealthy slept in private chambers, with space for attendants, while the poor often slept near the hearth, exposed to drafts and the flickering shadows of firelight, which added an element of fear or comfort depending on perspective. This stratification shaped more than just comfort. It molded attitudes about sleep, privacy, and what it meant to rest properly. All these customs, rituals, and beliefs have subtly trickled down through the centuries, influencing our modern understanding of sleep. Even if we no longer believe in spirits or divine dreams, the very idea of sleep hygiene, mindful rituals before bed, or using herbal teas as a calming agent has roots that stretch back to medieval times. Today, we place importance on creating a cozy, protected sleep environment, much like those medieval folks with their charms and relics. And those divided sleep patterns, they are experiencing a slow comeback as sleep research recognizes that our ancestors might have simply been listening to their bodies more closely than we do, instead of rejecting the idea that our nocturnal habits are deeply rooted in biology, culture, and centuries of tradition. But beyond the practical influence, perhaps the most enduring legacy of medieval sleep customs is the way they remind us that rest is more than just a biological necessity. It's a cultural act, wrapped in stories, beliefs, fears, and hopes. Whether it's the charm we hang above our bed, the prayers we whisper before sleep, or the way we treasure our quiet moments of reflection in the middle of the night, we carry parts of that medieval worldview with us, subtle echoes in the rituals of modern life. And maybe, just maybe, understanding these long-ago customs helps us see sleep not as a simple biological function, but as a sacred, mysterious, and deeply human experience, stretching across centuries, woven into the very fabric of who we are. So, as you gently close your eyes tonight, think of those medieval dreamers, hidden in their canopied beds, whispering prayers, and living in a world where sleep was a gateway to divine messages and unseen worlds. all carried forward in your own quiet, miraculous journey into slumber.